Good afternoon. I'm Perry Bacon. I'm the host of the New Republics Right Now. I'm honored to be joined by the University of Denver political scientist Seth Masket. He's a great scholar. I've known him for a long time. He worked with me a little bit at 538. He's expert particularly in political parties and writes really well about both what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are doing. He interviews activists, he interviews scholars, and he does some really great work. He also has a Substack called Tusk, which I read regularly, subscribe to, and learn a lot from that as well. So, Seth, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on, Perry.
So, what I want to start with was you did a couple posts last week that I thought were interesting and helpful. And the first was you call it a day of lawlessness, and you said the administration made 3 attacks on democracy in one day. And you referred to the ICE person killing someone in Minneapolis, obviously, and then Trump's threats about taking oil from Venezuela and using the money for that and sort of spinning it on his own. And the third one was Trump talking about what we're doing with Greenland. And what I want to get at in those 3 examples is I think it's worth unpacking as a political scientist. What is the difference between, like, there are things I oppose as a left of center progressive person. Why are those things violations of U.S. democracy, not just things liberals don't like?
That's a very good question. And I would say it's important to think about when we talk about democracy and threats to democracy, we need to be thinking about this more broadly than just, say, election day, right? That, as long as people can vote, it's a democracy. And if there's barriers preventing them from voting, then it's non-democratic. Democracy is way more than just like the handful of hours we spend dealing with an election each year. There are things, and when I'm talking about like threats to democracy, I'm referring more generally to like threats to our constitutional order, threats to the checks and balances system between the different branches, threats to basically the things that in some ways that the founders put in there to keep the country from becoming tyrannical, to keep it from becoming a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime. And that includes things like, undermining Congress's power for spending money or for deciding whether we're at war or not. In those situations, yeah, there is really this shared power agreement that the president and the legislative branch are supposed to have. And, Trump in a number of these cases is just sort of like either ignored Congress or basically they need to do whatever I say. And with with the horrible events that happened in Minnesota last week, we're talking about this ongoing situation where you have masked, armed agents of the state, essentially wearing combat gear with machine guns, who seem to have just absolute immunity to go into different neighborhoods and to profile people by race or the language they're speaking, and just to decide to, make their lives hell as long as they want, or even kill people, and just be backed up by the president for that. Um, Again, that doesn't necessarily directly attack our ability to vote in an election, but it's just more broadly, this is not consistent with democratic rule. This is not consistent with the broader themes of our republic, where people are essentially free to do what they want unless there's some very specific threat or some very specific allegation of criminal behavior. This really kind of perverts that.
And talk about Venezuela and Greenland in that context.
Yeah, with Venezuela, there were a couple of things going on there. In particular, the thing I was mentioning in this piece was Trump's claim last week that he was simply stealing. He was simply seizing, I think it was something between like 30 and 50 million barrels of oil, of
Yeah,
Venezuelan oil,
right.
and just saying the United States would be selling that oil at market rates, and would be pocketing that money from it. But that money would not go to the U.S. Treasury. It would go to some bank, not within the United States, but is known to people. And Donald Trump said he would be controlling that money to make sure it's used in the best interests of the people of the United States and Venezuela. That is absolute king stuff. Like that is, that is not consistent with democratic rule at all. It is not consistent with the existence of a Congress. It's just sort of wildly outside that. And we would just sort of have to accept the president's word on faith that he is not pocketing that money and that he's using it appropriately with basically no oversight. It strikes me as beyond anything we've really looked at before here.
I want to talk about the other piece you wrote last week. Or one thing that I jumped out at me is called "We F," and you didn't put that word in. We warned you. Talking about political scientists and the political science community, in your view, and I think that's correct. What I read in the run up to 2016, warned that Donald Trump was not just a Republican, but also someone who would break the constitutional order. And I guess you wrote a piece in 2021 that was sort of angry about what happened. This is right when January 6th happened. So you sort of recycled that. So talk about why what political scientists have been saying as distinct from as a collective. I know political scientists are a very diverse group in a lot of ways, but political scientists are group. When you were trying to say, what have they been saying as opposed to Democrats or liberals or journalists for that matter?
Yeah, and this is a tricky area, and some of it is just like very petty on my part because I feel like, no one ever gives us academics any respect. And,
Right.
everyone's claiming we're just, fluffy headed eggheads or whatever, and we don't understand the real problems going on. And I've seen some criticisms online or from journalists just saying, wow, political science really missed what Trump was doing. And to a surprising degree, this was discussed that political scientists, either in things we were writing in journals and books, to some extent, people were giving talks or posting on Twitter or other social media about this is real. This is a different situation from the past. This isn't just about Democrats versus Republicans. This guy is posing a real threat to a lot of things we associate with democracy. That he is really very much from outside the norms um, of this system and potentially stands to do a lot of real damage. And, I cited, a few dozen examples in there of people saying these sorts of things from pretty early on.
Right.
From 2015 forward, warning that this would pose some real dangers, and which I think sort of culminated with January 6th. But that as I said in that piece, even on that day, that that threat is not over. There's still ongoing threats to the legitimacy of elections that he has really introduced. So, I guess in some ways I was trying to settle a score, but I also wanted to highlight some of the research that has been done specifically on him. And this is also an area where political scientists, like a lot of other academics, are a little wary
Right.
to take a public stance, take a side on something, particularly in an area. It's an area that we research. It's an area that we teach. We kind of have this norm that we're kind of supposed to be above board, not necessarily neutral, not necessarily non-participating, but that we're not supposed to just come out swinging for one party or another.
Right.
And I think a lot of the scholarship in this area over the last decade has been about political science scholars explaining, here's why this area is different. And here's why I feel I need to say something about what Trump is doing that doesn't have to do with debates over abortion or debates over taxes or gun use. Like, there's something very fundamental to education and to democracy here that's really at stake.
I assume it's getting more challenging. You teach at a university. I assume you have some students who are not, Democratic voters all the time, capital D, Democratic Party voters. How do you explain to people that democracy is a contested issue itself in politics right now?
That is something I'm honestly recalibrating from day to day.
Okay.
In some ways, it was an easier thing to explain back in like 2017 or so, because the students I had then knew that, okay, things were not quite always this way. It
Right.
was just a year or two earlier, we weren't talking about the same set of issues. And Trump did really seem like something new, something that was aberrant. My students today,
Hmm. Oh,
their whole political awareness has
right,
been
right,
the Trump era, right? They
right.
don't really know a time before that. They think of Barack Obama as some kind of mythical figure their parents talk about. And so that's been tricky to explain to them that, like, we're the ones who seem kind of out of date, saying, well, this is not the way things are supposed to be. It's like, this is the way they are. We don't get to choose that. Um, but yeah, it is an area where I'm trying to, like, I just came out of a class teaching about Congress and congressional behavior
Right.
and how, where vetoes come from and how members can override vetoes. And my students do have some sense that, like, okay, here's what the older textbooks say. Things seem different today. Why is there
Hmm.
a gap between those? How can we understand them? And I view it as my point to try to explain, Well, in some ways, these things are normal. It's not uncommon for a president to veto legislation he doesn't like for some reason that his party wasn't really in tune with. It's not unusual for the president to complain about a judge or to complain about the Federal Reserve or something like that. Um, what is unusual is the way he approaches it.
Yes.
Often, somewhat more randomly, somewhat usually with threats or even using the justice system. So I do try and parse where those differences are, and also to note that like it's not like things were hunky dory in 2014. Yeah.
I'm surprised I forgot about the biggest news of today, which is obviously if you were writing a piece today about lawlessness, you would put threatening the head of the Federal Reserve with an investigation for not raising interest rates. You'd say that was an example of a democracy a violation.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah. Particularly, focusing on an office that is designed to be insulated from political pressure. And is not supposed to be subject to the whims of Congress or the president. And here he's basically, oh, here's how I can apply pressure using the justice system. That's a massive, violation of what I would consider democratic norms and practices here.
Talk about well, I'll shift into this, but I mean, you're not necessarily a democracy scholar the way some other people are, but there's been some people talking about how we've moved from democracy to what was termed competitive authoritarianism. Other people saying maybe we're not there yet, or maybe there's not a binary we're discussing. So when someone asks you what is the state of American democracy, like what do you say?
I don't think I've come up with the exact right term. It is a
Forget about the term. Like what would you like? What do you say generally? Without no, you don't have to be pinned down by a term. Necessarily. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I think flawed democracy is probably the right way to be thinking about it. Potentially, you can make an argument for competitive authoritarianism. And what that really means is that, like, well, there are still elections, voters still
right.
have choices. The majority party can lose, but a lot of the deck is stacked in the majority party's direction. And, not just because of voter preferences, but because, the president is trying to make it harder for people to cast like an early ballot or to cast an absentee ballot or to do vote by mail. A lot of things that a lot of states have come up with to just allow people to vote more easily, and he's trying to limit that. And there's also a lot of like long-standing imbalances within the political system that long predate Donald Trump. The Electoral College we know gives an advantage to more rural states. Those have tended in recent decades to be more Republican states. So,
Right.
it gives Republicans a little bit of an edge. Even when they lose the popular vote, they can still sometimes win the White House. Gives them a little bit of an edge in the Senate as well. So, yeah, there are a number of those things that we still clearly do have, largely free and fair elections, but with some biases currently in the Republicans' favor, and now a president who is willing to, trying to erode some voting privileges, and also I think we saw right after 2020, probably the greatest threat there is he generally doesn't accept elections he loses,
Right.
and is willing to employ violence to try and get his way. That is, probably the biggest threat. And we generally don't see that in elections where he's not involved. Like even a lot of the special elections in 2025, Democrats had a pretty good run. Republicans largely just accepted their defeats and moved on to their
That's
next
a good point. I
line of
hadn't thought of
work.
that, but
But
yeah, those losses were
when
also
he
like blowouts, so that helped, I guess. But yeah, yeah,
right,
yes.
yeah. But when he's in the mix, he will tend to say things like any election he lost was fraudulent, and a lot of his party will go along with him on that. And that's a very dangerous area when like you're just sort of casting doubt on the legitimacy of a major election.
You wrote a book I really enjoyed about the post 2016 Democratic Party, arguing that like, no, but it also has some historical lessons about how Democratic Party in particular, these parties tend to learn lessons from their previous defeat presidentially and think about that. You interviewed a lot of activists after 2016 within the Democratic Party and sort of discussed how they saw the loss, because how the party, really the party actors, the key party activists view the loss helps define the next candidate, the next primary. So I'm curious, jumping forward, like 2024, Democrats lost. I think one thing you've told me, let's start with the thing is, one thing you've told me in the past is that it tends to be the Democratic Party kind of whenever they lose thinks they're too progressive on
Mhm.
quote unquote cultural issues. Like that's not a 2016 or a 2024 insight. That's a 1989, 1988 insight. Why that is true, right? That's sort of a pattern. The party thinks it's too. It's I think the word now is too woke, but the party sort of always thinks that.
Yeah, honestly, you could find that back to the 1960s or even
Wow.
earlier, where anytime the Democrats lose, back then they framed it as we're seen as too close to the civil rights movement.
Right.
We're too close to Jesse Jackson. There's always some version of it that we're seen as too left, which usually means too tied to people of color,
Yeah.
and we have to kind of pivot away from that. And so that was like, Democrats came out of George McGovern's loss in 1992 saying that and pivoted a little more centric to come up with Jimmy Carter. String of losses in the 80s they perceived that as they were too close to the civil rights movement. So they pivoted toward the white South, came up with Bill Clinton as a more moderate candidate, and they won with that. So that is a pretty consistent narrative that Democrats tell themselves when they lose, and you could see it as recently as going from Hillary Clinton's loss to Joe Biden's victory.
It's not necessarily how do I say this? It's not totally wrong. The sense that there are more white voters than black voters. There is something reductive about that, right?
No, it's not wrong, but I think it's first of all, it's the same sort of people bringing this up over and over again, and I don't know. One thing that seems to get lost in that is that there haven't been that many presidents who have won two terms, both by a majority of the vote. The most recent one was Barack Obama.
Mm.
And, he did something that, no Democrat had been able to do for decades. Um, and at the time when he was first running, there was all this concern. Oh, I don't know. His name seemed strange, or
Right,
he's
right.
being accused of having Muslim ties and all this
Yeah.
stuff. He's got a crazy preacher. Um, but he was able to win just, very large, comfortable majorities. And the party just seems to think that is either he was a one off or that is just something that's not possible anymore in Donald Trump's America. And it's sort of it's an aspect of the Democratic coalition that it kind of negotiates away without ever even having a discussion. Obviously, not completely. The party did nominate Kamala Harris in 2024. I think for a number of reasons, but a lot of the party figured, well, she's got a good shot at it, or at least a better shot than Joe Biden had. And I think that was a reasonable analysis. But these fears still do very much linger in Democratic activist minds.
So, what are you seeing post 2024? Because I think post 2016, I thought it was a clear narrative. Democrats, whether the narrative was true or not, this idea that Democrats ignored the middle of the country, they ignored the working class. Hillary was unpopular, and maybe we shouldn't nominate a woman. I think it sort of very logically included to older white men who had the veneer of being sort of more connected to the Midwest. So, like the Hillary to Biden thing made a lot of sense to me. What are you seeing right now? Because at least according to the polls, the person who benefited most in 2025 was Gavin Newsom, who has a lot of similarities to Kamala. I know he's a white man, but I would not have thought the Democrats lost. But the Democrats normally would not be in a normal situation would not be like let's choose a different candidate from California. And I don't know if Gavin Newsom is going to win or not, but I think it goes to the point is I don't know that the party has sorted out exactly why it lost 2020, 2024. And maybe it was the Kamala Harris says she didn't have enough time. And maybe that's true, by the way. Some people say that, abundant, we need to have better governance in blue places, which is kind of odd if you think Gavin Newsom is a solution. So I'd be curious kind of what you think or what you're seeing even.
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm trying to decide: do I want to write this book? I don't know, but
Yes.
um, but it's been interesting since. So I started doing a study like right after the 2024 election, where I just was reaching out to a bunch of Democratic Party chairs across the country to get a
Yes.
sense of why they thought Kamala Harris had just lost. And I did a follow up survey with those same people back in the summer of 25, just to see how
Awesome.
their views were changing.
Yeah.
And what really struck me is, like, first of all, their views were all over the place. Like you said, there's really no consensus. There's people who believe Harris lost for being too far left or for being too far right. That she lost somehow because of Israel Gaza, either because she was too supportive of Israel or not supportive enough.
Yeah.
Um, some will just say that she lost because she was a black woman. and the country was not prepared to vote for that. Others will just say, you know what, it was probably a function of the Biden administration's unpopularity. It was a function of uh, people's anger over inflation and the economy. And she did better than Biden would have, but she was still tied to that administration, tied to that party, and there was really no way around that.
Right.
And that, I mean, there's probably some truth to that. But one of the things that really struck me in doing this study is that, first of all, right after the election, these answers were all over the place. People had lots of different views. And 6 months later, when I did this follow-up study, the answers were even more dispersed. Like they had
Huh.
come,
Oh, that's interesting.
not only had they not come closer to a consensus, they'd actually moved farther away from consensus.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
So in that environment, it's not really obvious who the next proper nominee should be. Um, I think a lot of people are attracted to Newsom because, well, first of all, he's been, more aggressive than I think just about
Right.
any candidate, and putting his name out there early and being very aggressive toward Trump in a way that certainly makes, a lot on the left feel better.
And his state could be gerrymandered in a way that I don't think a lot of other states could.
Yeah.
Like Michigan both can't electorally, but I don't think there are a lot of seats there either. Yeah, so right.
Yeah, and also I think if you look at the Newsom's initiative to essentially do the gerrymandering in response to the Texas gerrymandering, that was a very concrete thing that I don't know that any other single Democratic leader could point to over the
Right.
last.
That's interesting.
Like
Yeah.
everyone was upset about one particular thing Trump did, and he did essentially the
Right.
thing to erase that.
Right. That's true. Yeah.
And it's hard to point to Schumer or anyone else having done such a concrete and very public thing that's so tied
Right.
with them.
So the people don't have a pinned down response. And I assume that what happened in New York City, Virginia, and New Jersey confused that a little bit too, because not that New York City is representative of America, but I assume that, but it seems like people like Schumer and Hakeem and the party are talking about affordability as if they learned something from Mamdani. I'm not saying they didn't think about affordability before, but it does seem like the New York race did change the discourse in the party, even if most people would concede New York City is not Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, I think a fair number of Democratic candidates have tried to learn from Mamdani. Not necessarily that they want to adopt his policies, but like
Yes.
they saw that he was a very effective campaigner for one thing. And also found, I think, very effective ways to talk about affordability to make it very relevant to people's lives. Democrats can certainly read the polls that's
Right.
at the top list of people's concerns. Most Democrats, whatever they're talking about, will try to tie it to affordability. And theoretically that voters will resonate somewhat with that. But one thing that really struck me about the 2025 elections is that Democrats did pretty well across the board.
Right.
With a lot of different elections, a lot of
Yes.
different styles of candidate, even at a time when the party itself is very unpopular. And a lot of Democratic voters really hate the Democratic Party leadership in a way that we've not really seen before. And I think you're going to see like a lot of midterm challenges in the primaries next year. But regardless, most voters are thinking about the election as they have in recent years is, are you supporting or opposing what Donald Trump is doing? And they see the Democrats as they're the pushback. Regardless of whether they like the party, it's the only other one out there. So you can still, at least in these elections lately, you can still kind of win something with nothing. That doesn't necessarily tell you what to do about the next presidential election, and whether they should be. I have no idea what they should be doing, but at least in terms of congressional stuff going on right now, as long as there are of the other party from an unpopular, aggressive president, that seems to be helping them.
So at this point, like people say presidential polls necessarily don't matter. I'm a little bit skeptical of that, only because in 2013, the polls did show Hillary Clinton doing pretty well, and she did end up winning the primary. I think the polls in 2017, Biden was ahead, but he wasn't. I think that was pretty open. Do you consider this sort of remote? Do you consider right now the Democratic primary to be sort of wide open?
It is very open
Yeah.
to a degree we probably haven't seen since '08, maybe even longer. I mean,
Yeah.
it's I mean, with Biden wasn't a slam dunk, but he was the best known candidate going into 2020.
Right.
People had generally warm associations with him as Obama's vice president. Um, but there is really not an heir apparent in the party right now. And to the extent Newsom has support, it's because he's had his name out there more than anyone
Right.
else. But over the coming year, with all these congressional contests going on and some gubernatorial contests going on, there's going to be a lot more names out there.
Hmm.
And at this, I would be very hard pressed to say like who the obvious choice is for Democrats right now. I think it's very open.
Okay. And just to finish, I think you're doing a book on the Republican Party. You just finished one. Is I have this right?
I'm just finishing up a book on it's sort of the Democrat or the Republican sequel to my last Democratic book,
Yeah.
looking at Republicans between 2020 and 2024. But it's
Did
very
they
much
not learn anything, or they didn't care what they learned?
it's not a learning from law situation.
Okay. What is it?
It's we refuse to learn, or it's we're going to deny that the loss occurred.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
hard to learn a lesson from a loss you don't acknowledge. So what they did was more of a doubling down situation, just sort of regarding 2020 as a fluke for a number of reasons, and instead going more in on the Trump direction. My book is called "The Elephants in the Room," plural on the elephants. It's about, I spent a lot of time focusing on local Republican leaders, local county party chairs across the country, who, interestingly enough to me, were a lot of them were very uncomfortable with the idea of nominating Trump for a third time in
Mhm.
2024. They generally liked his first term. They liked what came out of it, but they saw this as like this election could be close. He has a
Mhm.
lot of baggage that other candidates don't have. We have a number of very qualified people,
Interesting.
and Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, and others. Um, Maybe we should be thinking about someone else. And the fact is, like, their Republican voters, primary voters, wouldn't hear of it. They were just all in on Trump from very early on. And there was no amount of organization or persuasion that their party leaders could do to steer them in a different direction. So a lot of it is about the
The
essentially
party
party
can't
leaders
decide, so to speak.
or leaders losing their ability to lead.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Because the average county party chair at that level thought they needed a different candidate just purely based on like the chances of winning would be higher with somebody new. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Seth, this was great. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Perry. It's great talking to you.
Good to see you. Bye bye.